Okay, I think we're ready to start. Welcome to our program. For those of you who've been with us, thank you for coming back. And for those of you who are new to us, thank you so much for joining. My name is Yuko Handa, and I am the Executive Director of the Japan Society of Boston. I will have to say, this is a very special program for me. I've personally been looking forward to this program for quite a while now. I think the first time I talked to Rachel Saunders of the Harvard Art Museum, it's been months. So I am very excited that finally the day is here. Finally we can talk about Shotoku Taishi with all of you. But before I move on and officially start the program, I just wanted to share that chat is open. We always love to hear where people are joining us from. So please let us know, where are you? And also please send all of your questions through chat. There will be a Q&A session at the end. We also like to ask everybody to turn their microphone or their voice off while the presenters are speaking, so that we can concentrate on the wonderful information that they'll be sharing with us, and that we won't be distracted. But I know today you are here not to hear me speak, but to hear about what our speakers have to say about Shotoku's Taishi. So I would make, if it's okay with everybody, I will make my introduction very short, but I did want to introduce you quickly to our speakers. Rachel Saunders is Abby Eldritch Rockefeller Curator of Asian Art at Harvard Art Museums. She is responsible for the Japanese collections at the museum, and she is a specialist in medieval narrative and sacred painting. Angela Chang is the Assistant Director, Conservator of Objects and Sculpture, and Head of Object Lab, Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at Harvard Art Museum. And she is a generalist who enjoys the treatment and technical study of materials and objects across cultures and time period. Our third speaker, actually not in that order, is Stephen Schneider. He is Director of Horticulture and Grounds at the Northeastern University, excuse me, and former Director of Operations at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University. While he was the Director of Operations at the Arnold Arboretum, he oversaw the activities of the public programs, horticulture, plant production, and facilities departments, and he also curated and managed the Arboretum's bonsai and Penjing collection. So there's a lot to be excited about our speakers today. I also wanted to add a little bit of the fact of Shotoku Taishi. When we were preparing this program for you, and we were in conversation with our three speakers, I was sharing with them how, to me, having grown up in Japan, Shotoku Taishi is almost like Leonardo da Vinci, so wise, so grand, so, important, that I said seeing Shotoku Taishi as a 2-year-old was almost a little bit unnatural. But that opened our conversation up to all sorts of very interesting facts, which I'm not going to go into, because I think, like I said before, you are here to hear our speakers. So with that said, Rachel, start us off, please.
Thanks, Yuko. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right, is that working? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Yuko, for that really warm introduction. We're really excited to be here with you. It's actually our first ever event with you, and I hope it won't be our last, but thank you for the invitation. We're delighted to be here with you and with everybody out there in the audience. I can see people coming in from quite a number of different places, so it's great to be with you this evening. So as Yuko said, I'm Rachel Saunders, and I'm the curator who's responsible for Japanese art at the Harvard Art Museums. And our most recent production has actually been something a little bit different. It was an exhibition, a special exhibition called Painting Edo, Japanese art from the Feinberg collection, which has just actually finally closed. But you can still access it. Here's a shot from the first room that you would have seen if you've been able to see it in person. But you can still access this exhibition in a number of ways online. And we have an exhibition webpage. We have 15 or 16 videos that we made during the period of COVID. We have an online exhibition down here, and we have a bunch of programming too that we recorded, a little bit like what we're going to do this evening. So if you're interested, please do take a look at the Harvard Art Museum's webpage where you can find all of this. And if you're really interested, we also have a couple of catalogs that went along with the exhibition as well, and those are available from Yale University Press. So this evening, it's really a great pleasure to be with you to talk about a subject that's very close to my curatorial heart with my colleagues, Angela Chang, who's the head of our objects conservation lab, and with whom I work very closely on an almost daily basis, and with Stephen Schneider, who was, as Yuko said, director of operations at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and who has just moved to be the head of horticulture at Northeastern University after more than 2 decades at Harvard. So Angela is a specialist in the conservation of 3-dimensional objects from ancient to modern. And Stephen's responsibilities when he was at the Arboretum have included oversight of horticulture, plant production, public programs, and facilities. And as Yuko said, he was also the curator of the bonsai collection there. He's also led several seed collecting trips to Japan in the last few years, where he was able to engage another interest in natural building materials and master craftsmanship. And Angela and I began working with Stephen much more recently in the last year of virtual programming, in fact, and he's been opening our eyes to some new ways of looking at the star of our program today, who is Prince Shōtoku at age 2. This sculpture that you can see here on the screen, a sculpture which dates to about 1292, making it the oldest of its kind in existence. The sculpture is about 68 centimeters high, or 2 feet if you do feet, but he has a remarkable presence, and he's really a great favorite at the Harvard Art Museums.
The groceries are here.
Oh. He's affectionately known as Shotoku on campus. He's been resident at the museum since the late 1970s, but in the last 3.5 years, he's also been at the center of an ongoing collaborative international research project. Curatorially, our overarching question has been, where did this sculpture come from? And we've been investigating the sculpture from multiple angles to enable us to make the best informed decisions we can about how to care for him materially, intellectually, and spiritually. And as you'll see, Prince Shotoku is complex, and it's taking the proverbial village, now comprising more than 100 individuals on 3 continents, to begin to answer the questions that he raises. In a way, a new community has formed around him, and I've been particularly fortunate to work very closely with experts at the Strauss Center and the Harvard Center for Nanoscale Systems, as well as faculty and students at the university and now at the Arboretum as well. In research terms, this is really a curatorial dream come true, but it's the new perspectives that we keep gaining by looking together and constantly cross-checking and cross-referencing our questions, our findings, and then our new questions that's really been so remarkable. In the summer of 2019, as you might know, if you're local to the area, we presented some of these findings in an exhibition. And again, you can still access that exhibition virtually via our website, where you can find several short videos on our Vimeo channel and a digital tool to help you explore further. And I think you'll find at the top of the chat, there are links to help you access those if you'd like to see them. So let's take a closer look. So this sculpture is wooden, and it's carved from Japanese Hinoki Cypress wood, and it has a hollow body cavity. As you can see, it's the figure of a small child who's wearing red hakama trousers, and he's holding his hands together in reverence. While the torso appears motionless, the left knee is actually positioned slightly ahead of the right, and the folds of his hakama generate a sense, just a slight sense of forward movement. His torso is now quite blackened, probably by incense or candle smoke. But you can see from the areas around his neck and under his arms and the back of his ears, for example, that his skin was originally painted white. His head is shaven, and it would originally have been blue-green like that of a Buddha. And he has many of the features of a small child. The Hinoki cypress wood has been exceedingly carefully modeled to produce the sense of the softness of a child's skin. And there are also areas of slight chubbiness at the wrists and the belly and the back of the neck, for example. And if you look very, very carefully, you can see, I don't know if you can see the arrow, my cursor here, but you can see just behind his ears, there are even these little downy baby hairs, these sort of uge behind his ears. And these features all combine to create a sense of immediacy that is very familiar and very appealing. But the real masterstroke in creating a sense of animation that sort of suffuses this sculpture and his sense of presence is in the eyes. And these are back-painted rock crystal lenses, and Angela is going to talk about that a bit more, but they catch the light just enough to impart a slightly uncanny sense of living presence. And when you're with him in person, you sort of have the feeling that he might just move or he might just look back at you. But although his form is that of a small child, his facial expression is almost severe. As you can see, his brows are slightly knit and his eyes are somehow simultaneously downcast and focused on something beyond our field of vision. In a sense, we simultaneously encounter a small child and the tranquility and the authoritative distance of an icon. So when we're in person and when I'm talking with groups at the museums, we always spend a little bit of time talking about who Prince Shotoku was. And I know that that might be superfluous this evening. I don't think we need to spend too long on that, but just for the sake of completeness, we would usually talk about the fact that Prince Shotoku or Shotoku Taishi may or may not have been a real historical figure who may or may not have lived from about 574 to 622. But really the important thing in this case is that he's regarded as a very important statesman, and in particular for this sculpture as the putative founder of Buddhism in Japan. And as I'm sure you're more than aware, this year is of course being marked in Japan as the 1400th anniversary of his death, with plenty of special events and even a number of exhibitions that I really wish I could have seen. But another thing that we talk about is how a rich sacred biography grew up around Shotoku Taishi from as early as the 7th century, including approximately one miracle for each year of his life. And this sculpture captures the miracle that he performed at the age of 2, when he surprised his parents by standing up and taking a few steps forward, facing east, and praising the Buddha with the words Namu Butsu. Whereupon he was found to have manifested a bodily relic of the Buddha in his hand. And here, in between his hands, this is the sculpture's hands here, and this is an X-ray of his hands. You can see we actually have a dried lotus seed in between the hands there. You can just see it right here. My arrow is right on top of it at the moment. And it's a kind of analog for the relic that he was supposed to have manifested. Now, this sculpture came to the United States in 1937, when it was found to contain a group of relic-like objects, almost 70 objects in all. And this was a source of great excitement, as I'm sure you can imagine. They included many paper objects, and you can see some of them here. They've been mounted, flat mounted to these boards. There are a number of little books. There's a hand scroll here, and two tiny little booklets down at the front here. There are also a number of small sculptures. This is one of them. This is the largest actually of the small sculptures. This is Aizen Muir, Wisdom King. And to give you a sense of how large this was, it's about 13 centimeters high. Here's a picture of him in Angela's hand. So you can see he fits in the palm of your hand very comfortably there. There were also a number of smaller sculptures, even smaller sculptures. Here we go. We have two Juichimen Kannon, two 11-headed Kannon, another Aizen Myo, Jizo, and Yakshi Nyorai here, medicine Buddha. And again, to give you a sense of the scale, there's my thumb next to one of them. So they're absolutely tiny. In particular, the 11-headed Kannon, who has her own little shrine here, is a spectacular example of miniature carving. There were also a large number of shari grains, or bodily relics of the Buddha. They look very large on the screen here, but as you might know, they're actually very small, about the size of a grain of rice each. And this is a large number to find inside a sculpture. And then there was also an incredible Lotus Sutra that was printed in China around 1160. And must have been imported to Japan before it was placed inside the sculpture. So these objects are all extremely well preserved, in part thanks to the quality of the wood from which the sculpture itself is made. And Stephen is going to tell us a bit more about that. But what had all the scholars very excited was the idea that the sculpture might be a kind of time capsule, and that this group of objects had apparently been undisturbed for more than 700 years, and that they might therefore offer a very intimate view of a specific kind of devotional practice dating back to the 13th century. But of course, for that to be so, we have to be certain that the sculpture had indeed only ever been opened once in 1937. Many sculptures with groups of objects, these relic-like objects inside them, have been opened multiple times during their lives for repairs and so on. And so it's pretty unusual for this never to have happened. So that was one really big question for us. And the objects themselves, they're extremely varied and in some cases really quite personal and now difficult for us to interpret. It's really only recently that we've been able to make significant steps forward using previous research and much more recent discoveries. And we're even beginning to identify some of the people who donated these objects to the sculpture. But as I say, none of this would have been possible at all if it were not for the wood. And this is the very special Hinoki Cypress wood from which the sculpture is carved. And we needed to know more about the qualities of the wood to really understand this sculpture, to take it back yet one more step to the moment before the sculpture was a sculpture, to the raw wood out of which Prince Shotoku is constructed. And for that, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Steve Schneider, who's going to tell us a bit more about Hinoki Cypress and why it is so special. Here, take it away, Steve.
Thank you, Rachel. So, it's exciting to be a part of this. Thank you for having us, and let's talk Hanoki. And everybody knows by now that I was the Harvard defector. I'm at Northeastern University now. But when I was at the Arboretum, one of the best jobs that I had by far was curating the bonsai and penjing collection. And so start my part out with a picture of the oldest plant in the at the Arboretum, which just happens to be a Cypress obtusa. It is one of the bonsai that was brought over from Japan to the United States in 1913 as part of the Lars Anderson collection. This tree began its life in a pot in 1737, which means that it was likely between 15 to 20 years before when the process first began to put it into the pot. So through the centuries of care that continue today, this tree is just a smidge over 4 feet tall and 5 inches in caliber thickness, as thickest part in the center of the stem. Certainly not the caliber wood our Prince Shōtoku would have been carved from. Next slide, please. All right. This is what the tree looks like when it hasn't been kept in a pot for 280 years. This particular tree was collected in Japan by Charles Sprague Sargent, the Arboretum's first director, in 1881. Native to Japan, the Hinoki cypress will get between 50 to 75 feet tall and is a medium to slow grower depending on the conditions. This tree in particular is about 55 feet tall. And just a quick aside, all of the plants at the Arboretum, if you go to visit, and I hope you all do, are labeled with copper color tags. And some like this, which you see in the lower right-hand corner. And then some, like the tree where my hand is, have trunk labels for ease of reading as well. This particular tree has multiple leaders, and the largest one, where my hand is, measures roughly 22 inches in diameter at breast height. It's a magnificent specimen and a fine example of the size trees prized for lumber in Japan. This is the same tree, but this time with a view of the height and architecture of the multi-stem structuring. Remember, at half the age of our 1737 bonsai, this 55-foot tree towers over it, yet both are the same species of plants. The ability for Hanoki to be dwarfed and the dwarf varieties currently available in the nursery trade have made them very popular landscape plants in the United States. The foliage is a deep green, scaly, and waxy, gentle and soft to the touch. You can see the male cones that have formed at the terminal ends, which are those purpley black dots there, that will eventually throw pollen. And then the underside of the foliage pops with a beautiful white pattern. These are called stomatal bands, and you can think of stomates as the nostrils on the leaves for gas exchange in plants. The picture on the left is one of the female cones. I think they look like little brown volleyballs. And then as they dry and split, these naked winged seeds, which you see on the right-hand side, are released. And this is a picture of some seeds, some Hinoki seeds from our seed herbarium. When you go on foreign collecting trips, almost all of the material that we bring back is in the form of seed. Seed is tricky. Most seed need some sort of external treatment to let their internal clock know that it's safe to grow. In the wild, it's seasonality and other environmental conditions that do this naturally. But in a greenhouse, we use a refrigerator to simulate winter and a toaster oven to mimic a forest fire, and sulfuric acid to replicate travel through a bird's gut of the seed. So Hinoki is relatively easy. The seed is packed in damp sand and put in the refrigerator for 2 to 3 months before we sell them. As you've probably noticed in the previous slides, the bark has a beautiful cinnamon brown color and exfoliates in long strips. The tree produces a beautiful soft wood with very tight grain. This quality, along with the tree's natural oils, which give off a hint of lemon scent when you first cut into it, make the wood naturally resistant to pests and pathogens. In the lower left of your screen, you see some freshly cut Hanoki lumber. And so pay close attention to the large flat sawn board in the center and its end grain pattern. This will come up later when Angela is talking about the materials used for the prints. The above picture is an example of what the tight grain of old growth looks like when compared to the same species that has been rapidly grown for commercial lumber, such as pine or spruce. So from a cultural and industrial perspective, Hinoki is very important. Sustainable lumber production has been practiced in Japan for millennia. Research continues in universities across the country. In 2018, colleagues and I partnered with Utsunomiya University to collect tree seed for the Arnold Arboretum. Our journey began at the university's experimental forest, which is what you're looking at here. Most of the forest was still in a natural state, but other parts had plots, such as this one, to study best practices for commercial tree growing. This is what a farm stand of Cypress obtusa looks like. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can see that each tree is numbered with a specific number for treatment, and you can see then if you look closely at the broader forest, you can see where those numbers are. So the statue of Prince Shotoku was created from old growth Hinoki, which is becoming increasingly rare in Japan. The largest source of mature 275 to 350-year-old trees are found in the Kiso Valley forests. And you'll see that area marked on the right panel of your screen. The forest houses the 5 sacred trees of Kiso, which are Cypress piscifera, Cyadopodes verticillata, or the umbrella pine, Thuya standeshii, Thuiopsis stolobrata, one of my favorites, and of course, Cypress obtusa. The wood harvested from these trees are prized for the building of Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples, and many of the sacred objects housed in these buildings, and the demand is growing. In 2019, on another expedition for the Arboretum, I visited the Ise Shrine in Mie Prefecture. This is Japan's oldest and most sacred Shinto shrine, yet it looks pretty shiny and new. That's because it was rebuilt from the ground up every 20 years. This is also the tradition for several other Shinto shrines in the country as well. The practice illustrates a belief of impermanence of things, represents a belief of death and renewal over nature, or of nature, and happens to be a great way to pass down building techniques from one generation to the next. Ise has been rebuilt a total of 62 times, most recently in 2013. All said, demand is outpacing the availability of 300-year-old trees. Here's a closer look at a shrine renewal with Hanoki. In 2017, I visited the Hikawa Shrine in Old Omiya City. This was a small section of the complex that had been rebuilt, but clearly a lot went into it. And we know, of course, that Hanoki was not just used for structural purposes in shrines and temples, but also for the artwork that provides important symbolism for these religions. You probably recognize this famous panel, the three wise monkeys, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. Recently restored, this is the most famous of the 8 panels that adorn the horse stable at the famous Toshigu Shrine and Temple in Nikko. And yes, you probably guessed, just like Prince Shotoku at age 2, these were all carved from Hinoki Cypress as well. And with that, I'm going to pass the Hanoki branch over to Angela, who will be talking about her fantastic work with this magnificent piece.
Thank you also to Yuko-san and her team for welcoming us so warmly. So from here, with the life of the tree, the life and the beauty of the tree in mind, I'd like to talk about the role of wood, specifically Hinoki Cypress, in the meaning and making of this remarkable sculpture. I recently learned about Shinto Prayer said by carpenters who restore temples. In it, they acknowledge taking the lives of trees, and they pray for a long second life for the trees in their service to the temple. I'd like to adopt this idea of a second life in the wood of our sculpture of Shotoku Taishi. Rachel noted his presence, and today I'll explore what underlies this energy and what we've found in investigating its manufacture. As we take a close look, I hope to illustrate that the wood species, the quality of the wood, and the skill of the sculptor together comprise the powerful presence we see and feel in the sculpture. First, I'll note that we were fortunate to have the expertise of Dr. Takao Ito and Meshtiel Mertz, who are wood anatomists specializing in Buddhist sculpture. They identified the wood species as Hinoki Cypress through thin section analysis. In this technique, they prepared a tiny sample, which you see here next to the coin, to examine the cell structure and growth. Notably, they observed that the wood used for the sculpture had an especially fine grain, even for a species known for this quality. In Japan, Hinoki is regarded as one of the most important species within an often self-described culture of wood. Complementing this reverence for wood, Hinoki is prized for its physical and biochemical properties, some of which Stephen mentioned. It's been long used for architectural timbers in temples and shrines, where its strength and resistance to decay are vital. For Buddhist sculpture, Hinoki has been the most esteemed wood since the 10th and 11th centuries. Its fine, even grain lends itself to being split and carved, and it makes the wood resistant to warping. Beyond these working properties, the association of a tree with a site or an event, such as a lightning strike, can further impart sacred value. So here are a few examples. On the far left is Horiuji, founded by Shotoku Taishi in 607. Buildings on this site are some of the oldest wooden structures in the world. And in the top right, this colossal hand of a Buddha is in the collection of the Harvard Art Museum. It's made out of lacquered and gilt Hinoki cypress. In everyday modern life, Hinoki is prized for many uses, from bath furniture to table tennis blades. Steve mentioned the lemony, sort of woodsy scent, which is often made into essential oil that's touted for its healing properties, such as promoting relaxation, decongestion, and improving immunity. I think it's helpful to think about the original context of our sculpture. While we don't yet know a specific, or haven't yet confirmed a specific temple site where it came from, there are many Shotoku statues of this type living in open temple settings. This example is at Enjoji in Nara, within the beautiful gardens that you see at the bottom here, and behind this gate is the main hall, centered on a sculpture of a seated Buddha. And in the far left corner, here's my yellow circle, you can just see the gilt shrine containing the sculpture of Shotoku Taishi. We can see that he's a sculptor at work, surrounded by wood structures and trees in this open environment. I don't remember if Rachel mentioned, but this sculpture is of a type of depicting Shotoku at age 2. And Rachel and I were very lucky to see many of these in their context in traveling into Japan. And as you can see, they all have their own personalities and presences, and they're very different from ours, but the same too. They're so recognizable. What I do want to also point out is the variety of their states of preservation, and this is owing to the original manufacturing materials as well as the life they've had since being made. Wood became the dominant sculpture material in Japan in the Heian period, and Hinoki emerged as the favored species. At this time, statues were made from a single solid piece of wood, making them heavy and limited by the size of a log. They were prone to checking as they dried. So by checking, I mean this cracking that you see in the head of the sculpture along the grain. Camphor, nutmeg, or kaya, and Judas tree, or katsura, were other trees that were used at this time. Later in the Kamakura period, other techniques developed that created hollow sculptures made from single split logs or assembled blocks. These approaches made the sculptures much lighter and allowed the wood to dry evenly without checking. They also incorporated a lot of joining techniques to make larger sculpture with more dynamic postures. Hinoki was the dominant wood. These are models made by a contemporary sculptor named Eddie Koke, and they are on display at the Nara National Museum. The medieval techniques for Buddhist sculpture are still followed closely today. These are other works by Eddie Koke in Kyoto, which show different surfaces. Here is an unpainted sculpture. This one is gilt. This one is brightly painted. It actually depicts Shotoku Taishi at age 16. And at the right here, I'm showing you some of Eddie Koke's tools. They're very traditional. Most of them are chisels, some which are pushed by hand and others are struck with a hammer. And here you see a large saw. To examine the wood and internal structure of our sculpture, we used two different X-ray techniques, traditional 2D X-rays, such as you might get at the dentist or the doctor, and microcomputed tomography. Micro-CT is a technique that captures thousands of X-rays from as many angles to generate 3D images, as well as slices of a form. Greg Lynn, who is senior scientist at the Center for Nanoscale Systems at Harvard, has been a generous collaborator for this imaging and interpretation. We know from X-rays that the sculpture is hollow and comprised of front and back halves. This is a very brief overview of the construction process. Two wooden blocks were assembled and roughly carved. They were separated, hollowed, and seasoned. The head and neck were separated to make the eyes, which I'll get to later. And then the contents, which Rachel described, were added to the body cavity, and the sections were rejoined with added arms. The sculpture was then finely carved and painted. From here, I'd like to highlight some findings about this process from our study. So first, let's look at the bottom, which is something that we don't get to see very often. This is a broad section of wood that's rich with information. You can see an original square hole here, which was probably used to mount and stabilize the standing figure. In a CT scan of the base, we can see where the front and back halves were joined. This is the seam here. And in the middle, there are at least 5 pieces of wood around the hole that were cut when the sculpture was opened, and these have been replaced. These are evidence of the 1937 opening of the sculpture. So focusing on the wood, we can see the pattern of the fine grain, which you might remember looks like the cut wood that Steve showed us. When we thought about the sculpture's tree origins, it was tempting to imagine the sculpture emerging from a single log. And this was our earlier assumption based on the traditional techniques. However, if this were the case, we would see a circular grain pattern resembling a cut log like this. Instead, the wide arc of the grain, which is this, indicates that the wood came from an outer portion of the log. So maybe somewhere like this. So the idea of a single original log does not hold. Looking closely at the grain pattern here, the front and back halves create a clamshell pattern. So this mirrors this section here. Oops. Let me just go back 1 second. This is the clamshell pattern I'm talking about. I found that if I clipped this front section and flipped it, the grain pattern aligns perfectly over the back half. This tells me that the wood came from a single long block cut tangentially from a large log. So maybe a section like this. The block was twice as long as the sculpture is tall. It was cut in half, and the 2 halves were bundled together to carve the body and the head of the sculpture. So I have a quick demo here to illustrate this since it's a little bit hard to imagine. I have these kids blocks here, and here is my red rectangle corresponding to my image with my wood grain drawn with a Sharpie. So if this long log were cut from the tree, it was split in half, folded over on itself to create the front and back halves of the sculpture. And so that would give us this clamshell pattern that we see at the bottom. So why is this important? We know that this wood is old growth wood. It's very uniform in its grain, and knowing that the wood came from the exact same spot in the tree lends the wood yet more uniformity, which is great for the sculptor's working properties, as well as the aging of the tree. And at this point, I'd love to call Steve back if he's there to comment on the way the wood is cut and what the grain can tell us about the original size of the log, and also the age of the tree. Steve, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah. So this was a really when we were first putting all of this together, the early conversations about where in the log the prints came from was fascinating, and it was so exciting when looking at these scans, and it was very clear that these were part of the, it wasn't going all the way into the center of the log. It was definitely on the outside. And so, judging and trying to figure out, probably the tree that was not felled specifically for the statue, but the tree that the statue was made from was probably around somewhere between 300 and 350 years old, possibly even 400 years old, considering where in the tree this wood would have been harvested from. One of the advantages of doing it this way, this flat sawn plank, would have been to take out, it takes a lot of the tension out of the rings, and these growth rings are already super tight. And when they're cut like this, it allows for more movement during the curing process of the wood, and that way you get less checking, and in this case, no checking at all. And as you saw from Angela's photo of what they did earlier days, when they would go and take it from a solid log, and the statues would split and crack and check. That's because that tension, that ring tension, was still present. But by taking it out the way they did here, a lot of that tension was gone, and during the curing process, the wood was allowed to move, and therefore it didn't crack.
Thank you. I wondered, Stephen, is it possible to take measurements from these scans to really do a calculation of the age? I mean, you've approximated for us, but I wonder if that's being done in your field.
Yeah, you could. You could spend time, counting each one of those rings, and then, calculating or taking an educated guess as to, well, is this represent a third of the tree, a quarter of the tree, and it would allow you to get into that ballpark. Of course, there's carbon dating and all that other fancy stuff that would allow you to be more accurate, but you could play with the ring growth and come up with a pretty educated guess as to how old the tree was.
Great, thank you. I think in talking with you, Steve, we've sort of revised the age of the sculpture. We know that it's 700 years old from when it's made, but we can add on a couple of hundred years of its growth, of its life as a tree, making it, probably over 1,000 years old.
I think it's wise to give the tree some credit in this particular.
It did a lot of hard work.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on here. We're going to move on to look at the arms of the sculpture. From these views, you can see that the arms were pinned and joined to the front block of the sculpture with a loose tenon. So that's this block that you see here and this block that you see here. This is the shape of it, and you can see from the joint how precisely this is done. There's just no room, wiggle room in the way the wood pieces fit together. You'll note that the sculpture in general, with all of its parts, appears seamless and in excellent condition. This is due in large part to the careful preparation of the wood and the perfect joinery. And the bottom image here, this is a borescope image, which is a camera that was inserted inside the sculpture from that bottom hole. You can see what that tenon looks like and the familiar tight grain of this wood. In the side view, I'll highlight some interior grooves that we found, one pair at the waist and another at the knees. These were gouged out of the front portion only and end at the vertical grain. These grooves are all that remain of so-called interior shelves that were mentioned in accounts of the 1937 opening of the sculpture. We don't have any remnants of these shelves otherwise. The grooves suggest that the two shelves were actually narrow bars with space in front and behind them in the body cavity. So this is kind of the structure of a bookshelf that you might have at home, and this is what we are guessing was the internal structure of the sculpture. And this image here is a cross-section right at the belly, as if you were looking straight down from the head. And this is my kind of illustration of what one of these bars would have looked like. So they didn't create isolated compartments within the inside of the hollow sculpture, but they defined sections and helped organize the contents. By measuring the spaces defined by the bars, we get closer to understanding how the contents may have been arranged inside. The larger eyes and Muir sculpture could have fit in the upper torso, whereas these four larger paper objects could not have fit above the upper shelf. Lastly, I'd like to look behind the figure's perfect centered gaze. This technique is called Gokugon, crystal eye technique. It was refined in the Kamakura period. It starts with the hollowing of the head into this open cone shape that you see, and it tapers to a small opening for the eyes. These openings are less than a 1/4 inch wide, with delicate eyelids less than a 1/16 inch thick. So right here, I'm pointing to that. It's actually kind of skin thin here. And placed behind each opening is a lens-shaped piece of rock crystal or quartz, and it has details painted on the reverse. And then behind that is paper or cotton padding holding it in place, and a wooden block. And lastly, these layers are secured with pins into the head cavity. Here are some views from behind the eyes. You can see that this bow tie shape of the wooden block that supports the eye package in place. And then there are 6 wooden pins around that. So this is a really exacting technique. This 700-year-old example is a testament to the skills of the sculptor, as well as the capacity of the wood to support this delicate work. So we hope you've enjoyed this deep look into the botanical origins and making of the sculpture of Prince Shotoku. It was time we acknowledged and celebrated the hard work of nature prior to his life as an icon. As a conservator, I'm partial to understanding and appreciating art more deeply through its materiality, and I hope I've made a good case for it here. For this remarkable object and the significance of its wood, I invite you to consider the ideas and observations we presented today when you explore the virtual resources from our exhibition that's past, Prince Shotoku, The Secrets Within. I also invite you to visit the Arnold Arboretum in person to experience their collection of Hinoki trees. And here is a bird's eye view showing the location of the trees at the Arboretum. Thank you so much for your interest and attention today. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. How very interesting. Despite the fact that I know that I have heard these stories in other places, obviously it being Japanese, growing up in Japan, but how very interesting. Everyone, please, if you have questions, send them in chat. I have a few already that's in my direct inbox. First, I think this is a question for Rachel. You mentioned that there were a lot of collaborations in this work in trying to figure out the quote unquote, it says here, the mystery of the Shotoku Taishi. Can you share with us a little bit more about who these people were? Are they mainly, groups within Harvard, or are there a lot of other organizations that you have worked with in Japan?
Thanks for the question. Yes, we have a variety of collaborators, and we have a number of people on campus, but we are also working with a number of people in Japan, especially groups, a group at Nagoya University, specialists in Buddhology, and with curators and specialists in sculpture, particularly at Nara National Museum, Tokyo National Museum, and the Kanazawa Bunko. So I suppose the thing about the project is that, since 1937, when the sculpture was opened at the MFA in Boston, people have been trying to research where it came from and what it may be able to tell us. And what we're interested in is how to take care of it. And there's just been, it is such a complicated object. It is so complex in so many ways that it could never be completed by one person or one group of people. It needs people who are specialists in conservation science, in trees and wood, in Buddhism, in history of art, in sculpture, and it turned out also in nanotechnology, wood anatomy, a whole range of different disciplines, and as many different perspectives as we could bring to it as well, because the answers are not simple. And in fact, every time we think we may have found an answer to a question that we have, it generates 4 or 5 other questions that need a whole different series of processes to approach them. And I think what's been really important about it is the ability to cross-reference those questions and those answers between different disciplines. We've had a number of times where something that I have thought as an art historian has been proved completely wrong just by Angela or Steve or someone else looking in a different way. The assumption that the sculpture was made from a single log, for example, came from conventional knowledge about how Kamakura period sculpture was created. But when Angela and Steve got together and looked at it, they found that it was completely wrong. It was a different technique altogether. And we've had a lot of instances like that. But it's been very, very important for us to be working with colleagues in Japan on this and to be publishing and sharing our results in Japanese as well as in English, because that has been one of the things that held back research on this sculpture. There was some research published in the 1960s, but it was only published in English. And so there were never the partnerships made that I needed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. I believe this one is for Stephen. This says, it sounds like you have traveled in Japan from an eye of a horticulturist. Is there something different when you travel as a horticulturist versus a regular tourist? And also, where should I visit besides Ise Shrine if I really want to understand the true nature of how wood or trees are revered in Japan?
Wow, great question. I've never been asked that, so let me think. So I guess I'm a horticulturist, but I have lots of other interests, and I don't have it with me. But one thing that I absolutely fell in love with when I was traveling in Japan, and I've been there a grand total of 4 times, so not that many times, and just in on the main portion of Honshu. But I fell in love and kind of got addicted to visiting every shrine and temple that I possibly could to collect my stamp. So I don't have any tattoos, but I hear that people that get tattoos get addicted to like getting more and more tattoos. Kind of that way with stamps when I go to Japan. And so and just and when you visit some of these shrines and temples have the most gorgeous gardens you can find, and then you really start looking at the natural materials that are used to construct and reconstruct these structures, and it really does begin to give you an appreciation, especially for the craftsmanship. Fine craftsmanship is something that you really can't find a lot of here in the States. Everything is just kind of thrown together with using lots of machines and automation. Whereas you go visit these structures and you can see what exactly human hands combined with natural materials can do. And so, spent plenty of time in the bigger, busier cities. I mentioned Utsunomiya, and if you go there, you also get addicted to gyoza and put on about 20 pounds before you go home. So I highly recommend that. But then also getting off into the mountains, we spent quite a bit of time in Wakayama and up in the mountains, and it's very rainy there. I survived a rainstorm where I have been drier standing in the shower, but we were collecting. We were after one particular plant I mentioned earlier, the Japanese umbrella pine, Sciadopitys, and just getting up to see, and at the Arboretum, and in many gardens you can see tiny little Japanese umbrella pines. They grow very slowly, but to go and see these huge, very very small populations, but huge trees of Sciadopitys. So getting up into the mountains, the train will take you everywhere, and then you can get off the beaten path and just go and get into the woods. Try to avoid the terrestrial leeches, and just have a blast and enjoy it. So a lot of times traveling as a horticulturist, I'm always fascinated by just even the Japanese seem to find even the tiniest spot to make the most elegant garden just outside their house. Whether they have acres or a tiny bit of square footage. And so I think that if you don't have a horticultural eye, people tend to walk by and miss those tiny details. I think I answered everything.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I will do a better job at tending to my garden so that I do not shame my heritage. But I believe this is a question for you, Angela. The question said, how does it feel? Does a cypress Hinoki statue feel different to the touch compared to other sculptures, say, that's made out of other wood?
I don't know if it feels different because of the wood itself. And I can't remember how much ours weighs, but from a tactile point of view, I don't think it feels that different. This is painted, and actually a lot of students, when they see this for the first time, we ask them what they think it's made out of, and they're not sure because it's so seamless and coated with this paint, with the paint on it. So I don't know that it's that different. I mean, what you're feeling is a very solid, smooth surface and beautiful carving. So it looks so fluid. You actually expect it to be soft, but it is wood. It's solid wood. But that's a testament to the work of the artist.
Actually, I think to this question, Angela, is another question that says, what does it feel like to be working with statues that are so old?
Well, the more that we learn about them, the greater our reverence grows, I would say, because we understand more about where they came from. And this one for me, I've been with for some years, so I really feel like, as Rachel sometimes says, I'm ready for him to move or shift over a little bit to get a better view of what I'm doing. He's been witness to so much at the museum and then in his life. But you know, it's part of what makes us enjoy learning and caring for sculpture is the history and the stories behind it. It's not just a thing that we're showing for its aesthetic properties. It's the history and the meaning behind it, especially for this kind of cultural object, which has so much inside that we can't see. So for this especially, we're privileged to access the inside and so much of it, and to study and know it that much better.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think this is, time flies when we're having such a wonderful time. And I believe, unfortunately, this is our last question, but what an extremely appropriate question. It says, what does Shotoku Taishi, or this sculpture, mean to you? How has it made a difference in your perspective professions? Should we ask Rachel first?
Sure. Oh, goodness. That's a wonderful question, and we have very little time, but I would say that, as Angela said, you really do have the sense of this sculpture as a witness over many, 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 many years. And I cannot refer to him as it in English. I just can't do it. Angela knows this. And in the beginning, I think it was a little strange for people in the museum to hear me talking about him and to be very personal about this sculpture, but it's the sense of the presence, the animation in the sculpture, but also the sense of the devotion of the people who created him and who left very personal pieces of themselves behind inside the sculpture. So we're very, very close to these people who never expected to be seeing in this way. I mean, they could never have imagined that he would end up in the United States in a museum. I mean, to imagine that happening. So although it's a very long time ago, I feel as though Prince Shotoku reminds us every day of the sort of multiple temporalities that we deal with in the museum and the multiple worlds that all come together under this roof, and how we need to be as responsive as we can in taking care of them, and to not regard them, as Angela said, it's not an aesthetic object. It's a living object, and we are engaged with him in a sort of sense of community, an ongoing living community. And every day we get a reminder of that from Prince Shotoku. So I think that's what it's done for me.
Wow, how beautiful. Stephen.
It's a great question. You know, it at the time when I first was introduced to this project and heard that it was Hinoki wood, automatically I thought of our ancient bonsai that we have at the Arboretum. And again, they'll be on display, by the way. They've been away for COVID, but they'll be back on display in August. And just thinking about how giving trees and plants are to people. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I really got into the field in the first place, is because they're such fascinating organisms. And just to think that, you know, the prince came from a tree that was, you know, over 300 years old. And we have at the Arboretum a tree that's, you know, about over 300 years old, but is tiny, tiny. And just the amount of influence that we can have and that the trees let us have on them. They let us cut them down. They let us harvest their wood. They let us make art out of them, or they let us put them in a pot and keep them small for, you know, centuries. So it just allows you to everyone has busy days, but the project has really allowed me to step back and think about exactly what kinds of natural forces are around us, and just appreciate them more.
Oh, how beautiful. Thank you so much for that. And Angela.
I have to choose what to say here because I'm so close to the sculpture. But I will piggyback on a couple of different things here. I think the sculpture is a symbol of what's possible in a community of people looking from their different points of view. Rachel often cites the community of nuns who created and contributed to the sculpture and how that community has just rippled and grown to all these people and now to your audience sharing this sculpture and our experience with it. So it's been so rich for me in that way. And it's a sculpture that's taught me a kind of patience. So it's a symbol of that because we've spent a long time looking, and the more we look, the more we see. And these are the details that Stephen's talking about, but I'm talking about them on a cellular level with this sculpture, which we were never meant to see, but as we look, we learn so much and appreciate it that much more. So it's ongoing for me, but for me too, I can't talk about it as an it. It's a he. I'll say that when I showed my child, she was just about 3 when we started the sculpture, so she was like close in size to this sculpture. It's about life size, but I showed her a postcard, and she said, "Who's that baby?" And it just spoke to the life presence of the sculpture, and we think about that all the time when we joke about it. But anyway, there are many, many layers that this sculpture of meaning of the sculpture for me.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Thank you, all 3 of you, for this really, really beautiful story that we heard today, an in-depth look into Prince Shotoku at 2 years old, the sculpture, in such short time. I feel like what's a blessing for us to be able to take such a deep look into him in this very short time. I think that's something that we need to be extremely grateful of. But what I've heard today is also what I feel every day at the Japan Society of Boston. And in many ways, thank you to our audience, because I think what I heard today is that questions lead to answers, and answers lead to more questions, which leads to more answers, which leads to more questions. And I think our big motto here at the Japan Society is that curiosity creates connections, and connections create community. So I really felt like through your work, it really strengthened our belief in our work of how all of us, with a little hint of curiosity, gets together, and here we are talking about this relationship that ties us together, the U.S. and Japan relationship that ties us together. The other thing, and this one I think is really thanks to all of you, but also to the trees and the wood, is I think a reminder that we are just a point in a long line called history. There were a lot of people and a lot of trees before us. We are just one point, and there is going to be a lot of people and a lot of trees ahead of us. And I think that is an important thing for us to carry with us today.